Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I want to show you a game I played last night. I played it as part of a consultation game. I was the captain of the black pieces, but the rest of the people on my team were much, much weaker. So really I was kind of playing black, but we were discussing the game as we go. A consultation game is where a group of people play another group of people, and they get to discuss it among themselves what moves they want to play. And it's a lot of fun. We do it every year on our annual club meeting. After the meeting, we play a consultation game. And this is the game that we played last night. I was the captain of the black team. The newly crowned club champion was captain of the white team. So let's take a look at the game. It was a really interesting game. I'll try to go through some of our planning and thought process here. It's very instructive. They were white. They chose to play d4. We played knight f6. They played c4. We talked about whether we wanted to play a Nimzo Indian or a King's Indian or a Grunfeld. We played g6. If they want to play an anti-Grunfeld here, they could play f3 or knight f3 or something. But they said go ahead and play a Grunfeld with knight c3. We decided not to do that. A Grunfeld would be d5 here. We played bishop g7, King's Indian. They played e4. We played d6. Now the two main moves are knight f3 and bishop e2. Usually they transpose. You play those both. In the master database, masters actually played knight f3 slightly more. Knight f3, we castle. They play bishop e2. This is the standard position. As you can see from the database, down here on the right, the master database, e5 is the main line. That was played 78% of the time. Of course, we knew that. On purpose, I played a rare line, a line that's maybe not quite as good, but if you look at the results, with knight bd7, against e5, white wins 37%, against knight bd7, white won 36%, against e5, black won 22%, with knight bd7, black actually won 32%. So the master database, knight bd7 actually did a little better. If we look at the engine, knight bd7 doesn't even make the top three moves. All right, so we played knight bd7, and they played castle, and we played e5. That's the correct break when you're playing knight bd7. It would not be as positionally correct to play c5 here. And now white should keep the center fluid. The main line, and after the game I talked to the captain of the white team. He said he had studied the main line here with bishop e3, but he kind of forgot it, and the team was moving fast. So they played the natural, but not quite as good d5. And you could see in the engine, d5 doesn't make the top three. In the database, it is fourth with 8%, but it also did less well for white. White only won 30% with d5, and white won at least 35% with the top three moves. So you can see playing d5 here is not quite the right idea. It kind of gives black what he wants, because now with the knight on d7, it could nicely hop into that c5 square, which simultaneously attacks the e-pawn, forcing white to guard it, which gives black time to preserve the knight, and that's what happened. White plays queen c2, the best move. Black plays a5. You could see in the database, this position was reached 641 times, and black played a5 637 times, which is, 99 point, whatever that is, 0.4% of the time, black played a5. So, of course, we played a5. The idea of a5 is very simple. You want to block white from playing b4 and driving that knight away. It's a very nice knight, and now black has a very solid position. It's not better for black. You could see the engine thinks after bishop g5, the white's better by about 0.2, but black's very comfortable here. So here white plays bishop e3, and the two candidate moves we looked at were knight to g4 and knight to h5. You almost have to move your knight on f6 here, because you want to play your break move f5 in most of the lines. You could play it to e8, but it's really not doing much there. You could play it to d7 so that you could recapture on c5 with a knight if he ever plays bishop takes c5 and not double your pawns. You can play knight g4 and put the question to the bishop and see where he wants to go. Or you can play knight h5 with the idea of maybe popping your knight into f4. This game was played with a time limit of 50 moves. and a 5-second time delay, so we didn't have a lot of time. We talked about this for maybe 2 minutes at the most, and we decided to play knight h5, and you can see at the database, at the stockfish analysis that knight h5 is the second move, but it's tied for first in centipawns at 0.0. So knight h5, very reasonable. Knight h5 was only played 3 times out of 60 games in Master Play. Knight g4 was played 28 times. So even though the engine says they're both equally good, we played the more rare move, knight to h5. All right, so here in the database, the 3 moves that were played were rook fe1, bishop c5, and a3. If they play a3, I can play a4 and stop the b-pawn from coming up. That's a pretty standard thing, although you have to watch out after a3, a4, bishop takes c5, d takes c5, knight takes a4, wins the pawn, so it's not quite that easy on a3. Let's see what the engine says. The engine says if white plays a3, black should play knight f4, and it should be about equal. All right, they played knight to e1, which the engine says is the second best move, and point 1, and now they're threatening bishop takes h5. So we played knight f4. The engine says that b6 and letting them take on h5 just to get the bishop pair is okay for black. Most people wouldn't want to do that. They wouldn't want to double and isolate their h-pawns here. So we played knight f4. That's the understandable move. And the engine says the game is about even, and with their best move, bishop takes c5, and they did play bishop takes c5. We have to recapture. So we could take the bishop with check on e2, but there's no reason to do that. The knight on f4 is much better than the bishop on e2, which is blocked by all those white pawns on central light squares. So playing this Zwischenzug knight takes e2 check is not really a very good move, and you could see it's about 7/10 of a pawn less good than just recapturing on c5. So we recaptured on c5, and they played knight d3. All right, so they're threatening knight takes c5, and the question is, how do you stop that? The natural move is to play b6 and guard it, and that's what we did. But amazingly, knight b6 is not in the top 3 moves. The engine actually likes knight takes d3 a little better. It also thinks queen g5 first, threatening checkmate on g2, which we looked at, but we decided it really didn't do that much, is also better. So we looked at the queen g5, we didn't like it. Knight takes d3, we didn't strongly consider that. So we just played b6, and you can see the engine still thinks we're 0-0, so b6 was probably almost equally good, even though it wasn't in the top 3. And now they make a mistake. Right now, black is, has the bishop pair, which is worth half a pawn, but white has more space, and his knights are compact, and his pieces are okay. He plays knight takes f4. All right, that opens up my bishop on g7 to become a monster bishop. Now, you might say, but black has 2 sets of double pawns. We have doubled f pawns, and we have doubled c pawns, and white has those 2 central pawns coming down the middle. Isn't that just good for white? I mean, he has the better pawn structure. Isn't that, more than enough for the bishop pair? And the answer is no. We can blockade in the center and kind of make those pawns immobile. And in this position, white really can't do much about it. He could sacrifice his e-pawn by playing e5. The engine doesn't like that. But the engine doesn't like white's position now at all. All of a sudden, the bishop pair and that monster bishop on g7, the engine jumped all the way up to 1.7. We were at 0.0. So they play bishop f3 here. And now we did something I rarely like to do. I have 5 pieces on the back rank, 4 of which want to play chess. The king is perfectly happy on g8, but the rooks, the queen, and the bishop all want to come out, and we need to move every piece once before we move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. But here I wanted to blockade the center and fix it so that they couldn't easily move. So I decided to move a piece twice, and you can see the engine thinks my move, bishop e5, is the best move to just block the position. And now the only way to get rid of that bishop is to maneuver the knight around with something like, I don't know, let's see, what's the best way to do it? Knight to e2, followed by knight to c1, followed by knight to d3 to hit the e5 square, but that's very slow. And meanwhile, I'll get my kingside pawns rolling. If he plays knight e2, I can play g5 threatening g4 or something like that. So White's a little bit stuck here. He really doesn't have a lot to do. And meanwhile, black can kind of consolidate and stop white from playing in the center and the queen side. And then black can push on the king side where he has all his pieces pointing and his pawns can easily come up, spearheaded by that pawn on f4. After the game, Jeff, who was the captain of the white team, said they considered already at this point playing g3 just to stop that kind of stuff and make me commit myself. The engine doesn't think g3 is in the top 3 moves, but it's an understandable thing because if they sit there and do nothing, black's going to really push on here. All right, so they played rook a d1, and in some lines they want to sacrifice their d pawn and put their knight on d5 and get an outpost knight. So we tried to figure out here what we should do about that. I think the engine says we should just let them do that. I think the engine wants us to play bishop d7. I think the line I looked at with the engine was something like bishop d7, d6, c takes d6, knight d5, and now play bishop e6, threatening to just take the knight. And I'm up a pawn, and even though there's bishop opposite colors, it's not an endgame, it's a middle game where my bishop is much, much better than their bishop. And this should be completely winning for black. You can see the engine says this is minus 2.7. So that would have been the right plan. We didn't find that plan. What I did instead was to play bishop b7 so that if they sack the pawn and put the knight on d5, I can take it with the bishop, but it really wasn't that much of a threat. So they play queen to d2, again getting another piece on that d6 square, trying to force that pawn up to d6 so that they can get some breathing room for their knight. I play queen f6, keeping the pressure on the dark squares and also getting out of the way so I can put a rook on d8. And now if they play d5 and we take with the pawn, c takes d5, and they play knight takes d5, I'll be very happy to play bishop takes d5. That was the idea. All right, so here they kept going after the d6 square with knight to b5. Let's click on that move. And now they have 3 pieces on it, and we have 3. So I overprotected with rook on a to d8. And they decide, oh, by the way, let's point out, if I play bishop takes b2, I thought maybe they could play d6 and then play e5 and hit the queen and hit the bishop. But the engine and my opponent both said, no, they were just going to take this pawn and be happy that now they have this protected passed pawn. And now black's lead is dropped dramatically. Instead of being up 2.5 pawns after that line, if I would take that pawn and let them trade it for the c pawn, I'm only up 1 pawn. So that would be positionally giving up my bind. So instead, we played rook a d8, putting a 4th piece on the d6 square. And now white's only break move is really to play a3 and b4. But they're worried that we're going to take the pawn now. Bishop takes b2. So they guard the pawn with, well, they play a3, offering the pawn. And as I said, I still thought that I can't take it. They can take on c7 still. So here we had to try to find the plan. And it's funny, the plan the computer wants to play is a plan that we talked about, but we said it was too slow. And let's look at the plan the computer wants to play. The computer wants to play h5 to keep his bishop out of g4 and to also get the king up so the rook can come over and help the pawns come down. So if they try to stop us with like queen e2 to stop the pawns from coming up, we can play king g7. They really don't have that much to do. The engine suggests rook d3, and now rook h8 to get the rook over there. And let's see here. The engine gives b3 to just save that pawn. Bishop c8, repositioning the bishop now to get into the attack, and again threaten to push this pawn up the board. And now the computer says white's getting desperate. He plays h3, bishop d7. In some lines I could just take that knight off. Rook f d1, queen to h4. Again, putting more pressure, guarding the h-pawn so I can play g5 and g4 and break open the king side. And at this point, the computer says black should sacrifice a piece to get, sorry, white should sacrifice a piece to get some play. Knight takes c7, bishop takes c7, d6 blocking this bishop out of the game. Bishop b8, queen b2 check, king h6, and it says black's winning. I'm up in the engine here. It says about I'm up 3 pawns. So the piece sack would give white some play, but otherwise black would just push those kingside pawns. We actually looked at that a little bit at that plan, and we rejected it as being too slow, but actually it's the right idea. So that's what we could have done if we were rated 3,500. All right, so we had the right idea, but the wrong move order. We played g5 right away, but that gives white a chance to play queen e2 and blockade that d1 to h5 diagonal. Let's draw a line there for you, d1 to h5, and make it very, very hard for black to play h5 and g4. So after g5, they played rook to b1 to guard the pawn first. I still can't play g4. I played queen g6, threatening g4, which would kind of win the game immediately. They played the only move they really can, which is to play queen e2. They could play bishop g4, and if I play h5, they could play bishop f5. The engine actually gives bishop g4 and then c6 to hit the knight, since the a3 pawn is now in the way of where the knight could go back. The knight after c6 would have some problems because the d pawn is pinned. It would have to go to like a7 and then try to take on c6 or something. So there is a lot going on both sides of the board here. White plays queen to e2, which is what we sort of thought they would play. And we play bishop c8. The bishop is no longer needed on b7 because he's not going to play d6 and knight d5. And now we're threatening g4, winning instantly, trapping the bishop. So we thought they might play bishop to g4 here, and the engine says that's not one of the top 3 moves. They played bishop to h5, hitting the queen. All right, so this is one of the most interesting positions. What would you play here for black? You could stop the video and try to figure it out. But in the game, we spent a lot of time comparing queen f6 with queen g7. The advantage of playing queen g7 is it keeps the queen on the g4 square so that we can play g4. It also doesn't block the f pawn so that we can break with f5 and open up the center for our bishop pair. Queen f6 blocks the break move, and it doesn't guard the g4 square, but on the other hand, it guards that 6th rank. So we were comparing the relative notion of those, and then all of a sudden I realized, wait a second, maybe it's better to play queen to h6, because if they're going to play bishop to g4, I might get lines where I can play f3. So queen h6, bishop g4, f3 threatens the queen and threatens mate. So there's some tricks involved, and they have to be very careful here. So I played queen h6, which the engine says is only equally the best move if they play it perfectly. And now we have some real threats on the board, but our opponents kind of missed the idea here. They realized we had something going, but they didn't quite calculate it all. They have to play a move like h3 here to stop our tricks. The idea of h3 isn't necessarily to guard g4, although it does that. It's also to stop checkmates on the h2 square. So instead, they broke on the queen side with b4, and that's the losing move. And then I looked at the board for a while, and I said, and then all of a sudden I realized, I'm like, oh, we're actually winning here. We have a winning move. So I showed it to the rest of my team, and I said, I challenge you to find a move that would stop me from winning the game after this move. If you haven't seen it yet, you can stop the video and see if you can find the winning move. But, of course, they tried to come up with some ideas to stop my move from being the winning move, but they couldn't, and then we played it. So the star move of the game is g4. This is simply a removal of the guard. I'm interfering with the queen guarding the bishop on g4. And you might say, well, that's a silly move. It's attacked twice and guarded once. But if they play bishop takes g4, we just play f3, hitting the queen with a pawn and threatening queen takes h2 mate. And we're instantly winning a queen for a pawn because they have to stop the mate, and we can just take off their queen with a pawn. So bishop takes g4 loses the queen to f3. But what else could they do? In fact, the engine says their best move here is to play queen takes g4 check, And after bishop takes g4, we just want a queen for a bishop and a pawn. Well, they didn't want to do that. I think one of the team members on the other team actually did say maybe they should do something like that. They could easily resign here. So they decided to sacrifice the bishop for a pawn and play bishop takes f7 check, which did not make us unhappy. So, of course, we took with the rook, and now that rook can actually come across to g7, and we're still threatening f3, winning the queen, so they pretty much have to play f3 themselves. All right, so at this point, we're up a piece for basically nothing. We have 7 pawns, they have 8, so they have a pawn for it. So we decided we'll just trade off some pawns on the queen side so we won't have as many weak pawns. So we traded a takes b4, they took back, and then we played rook g7, threatening to play g takes f3, and the pawn on g7 is pinned, and it's really hard. They really don't have any great ways to take it back, because if they take it back with the rook or the queen, we can play bishop g4. So they take the pawn on c5, and again, we could take on f3, but we just recapture. We're just trying to be solid here. They put the rook on d1. You could say that loses the exchange, but actually we're not even going to take it. We take the pawn on f3. They take with the queen. I played bishop g4, skewering the queen and the rook. They move the queen over to a3, hitting the pawn on c5. You might say, well, take the rook and you're going to be up a whole rook. Well, yes, but my bishop on g4 and my bishop pair are actually way stronger than taking the rook. The engine says the move we played is mate in 8, and it says if I take the rook, we do still have mate in 13. So there's nothing wrong with taking the rook, but I told my teammates, I like my bishop better than I like their rook, and I see a mating attack here. So I played f3, again threatening like queen takes h2 check and all that kind of stuff. So they played g3, and the engine says I should sacrifice my bishop. Bishop takes g3, and let's take a look at that line. Bishop takes g3. If they take back with the pawn, now I play f2 check, and it's mate in 5. Well, I did the same kind of thing, except I wanted to keep the bishop on the board. We didn't calculate it all the way out to mate. Bishop takes g3 is mate in 7. The move we played, f2 check, is mate in 8. They play the move that gives us the most trouble, king to h8. And now, we didn't really want to play bishop takes g3, queen takes g3, even though after bishop takes d1, my rook on g8 would be hitting the queen. And the engine says that's mate in 7. We didn't want to play bishop takes d1. So I played the third best move, which is also mate in 8. Rook to f8, threatening bishop f3 check. And they have to give up the queen, and then we'll mate them in a couple more moves. They play h4, we play check, and now they can't play king h2. Why not? Sneaky pin. King h2, queen takes, h4 is checkmate because that pawn on g3 can't take the queen because it's pinned to the king by the bishop on the e5. That bishop on e5 has been sitting there the whole game doing a great job. So they decided not to resign. They decided to play the last couple moves until we forced a mate. They played queen takes f3. The rest needs no comment. Rook takes. King to g2, rook on g takes g3 check, king here. Now we have 2 mate in 2s. We could play rook g1 check, king e2, queen e3 mate. But that's 2 checks, and I thought, rather than playing 2 checks, let's play a quiet move that leads to mate in 2 instead. So I played queen to e3, threatening rook g1 mate, and there's no defense. Not that that's surprising given the fact that we're up a whole queen. And they decided not to let us mate them. They resigned in this position. So our sequence on the dark squares really worked. Let's go back to see how that actually happened. So right here, their dark squares are weak. Why? Because they played bishop takes c5, and they gave up their dark square bishop for my knight to double the pawn. But then when they played knight takes, pawn takes, the dark squares become much weaker because my bishop on g7 becomes very active. And when I played bishop e5 to blockade all the light squares, the idea is eventually to push the kingside pawns and to activate the bishop. And it's not that easy to do it if white plays perfectly. But of course in the game they missed the one shot, and that was all it took. So let's keep looking at the dark squares. We play bishop there, so if they sack the pawn and put the knight on d5, we'll just trade it off. We get the queen on the dark squares so we can bring the rook over and blockade more the d6 square again. And there it is. We're blockading all the dark squares so the white can't make any progress. And now we start moving those pawns. As we showed you earlier, that wasn't the correct sequence. The engine said it was more correct to play h5 and king g7 and rook h8 instead. We didn't find that. We found that plan. We just rejected it. Rook to b1. Queen there threatening g4. Now everybody's going to fight for g4. He fights for g4. I fight for g4. He hits the queen, and we play there, which is equally the best move. But it gives a lot of tricks, and they have to see these tricks b4. By the way, the engine says we could also reverse the moves. Instead of playing g4, we could hit the queen first. And if they take with the queen, then we hit them with the pawn now, and they can't take with the bishop because we're threatening mate, and they can't guard the bishop with the queen either. It's not quite as good, but it does work. So f3 would have worked as well, but I like g4 better. The engine says g4 is about 2 pawns better than f3. Once we saw that g4 was working. Oh, hold on a second. Sorry about that. Little dog emergency. My dog had surgery yesterday and was chewing on something that she couldn't. All right, we're almost done here. g4. Once we saw that g4 was working, we didn't seriously look at other moves. And the rest really needs no comment, but we'll play it out real quickly again. They gave us a free bishop. Not that they could do anything else. They blocked that f3 threat. We traded off. We opened up the king side. We blasted them open. They tried to keep it closed. We said, no, 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 let's open it up. Tried to keep it closed. We said, we got too much power. This would be a great time to resign. They decide out of momentum to keep playing, and we won. All right, so it was a very instructive game. It's nice at my age to win a game once in a while. Last year we lost our consultation game, so it's nice to win the one this year. And I think it was a good instructive game, so I thought I'd show it to you. If you haven't told your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, please do so. That's the thing I ask. But if you'd like to like the video, or if you'd like to subscribe to the channel, those are great. We have almost 7,000 subscribers, and we've won awards in our videos for Best Instruction from the Chess Journalists of America. Talk to you next time. See you then. Bye.